Welcome back to another episode of Seahawks Forever. This one live, where we are going to be talking about the state of the union with the Seattle Seahawks. Not that other thing that's happening tonight, but we're going to talk about the state of the Seahawks roster with Seahawks beat reporter Corbin Smith. How aggressive does he think, as we are on the verge of free agency, John Schneider will be in free agency? There are some indications, and he's kind of given us some hints over the last couple of weeks, that it might be an atypical offseason when it comes to free agency for the Seahawks, but also because we know John Schneider loves a bargain. Who are some of the guys that might be flying under the radar a little bit that no one's talking about, but that would give great value to the Seahawks roster and fill some needs at the same time? Corbin Smith coming up next on the show. Let's do it.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
This episode brought to you by the folks at Doer, built for doing, lifestyle apparel for every occasion. And if you haven't heard me talking about them up until this point, well, get ready. I'm going to talk about them a lot. These stretch performance jeans are an absolute go-to for me. 20% stretch. They're made with breathable, antibacterial, and sustainable materials. That's one of the trademarks of Doer, but they're also built to last. They're built tough. They are built for doing. And right now, if you go to their website, shopdoer.com, that's spelled DUER/forever, they'll give you 20% off your first order for being a listener or viewer of the program. That's www.shopdoer.com/forever for 20% off your first order. Corbin, always good to have you on the show. I know it's been a busy couple of weeks for you. This time of year always is. Back and forth to Indianapolis. I know you had to leave the combine a little bit early. I want to start with this before we get into some of this roster stuff. There's been a lot of buzz over the last 4 or 5 days about a report that you made that while the Seahawks weren't shopping DK Metcalf, other teams were calling, and in particular, the talks with Green Bay went pretty far down the road to where some actual picks and names were being discussed. You've taken some heat for that report, even though it was backed up by Peter Bukowski, who covers the Packers from the other side, and other reporters as well. I guess, what's the latest on that? What are your thoughts now, kind of 4 or 5 days after that whole thing? And why do you think reports like this make so many people upset?
Well, I think that the emotion is a big part of it, answering the last part of that question. I mean, DK Metcalf is a fantastic player. And look, I am a reporter. My job is to report the information that I receive. Do I want to see DK Metcalf get traded? No. And I've had plenty of fans like anti-DK sentiment. Like, you know how many players that I've had good relationships with that were great players in Seattle have left? You know, I don't make those decisions, but my job is to report when there looks like there potentially could be a move made. And listen, I can't go into details about who my sources are, but I know that my sources are 110% correct on this. And John Schneider is not trying to move DK Metcalf. Again, this is not active shopping. This is not John Schneider picking up the phone and calling Green Bay and saying, I want to get rid of my all-pro receiver. What will you give me? That's not how this is going. However, the Green Bay Packers, and John Schneider has talked about this before, Dan, I'm sure you've heard a couple of his press conferences in the past where you always have to keep your ears open. You have to be willing to listen. That's what happened with Russell Wilson. They got an offer that ultimately they decided, hey, we can't refuse this. And with DK Metcalf having 1 year left in his contract, and the fact that he's probably going to be demanding at least $28-29 million per year, if not in the $30 million per year range, as good of a player as he is, that is a huge chunk of change for a non-quarterback. And so there may be internal discussions that have been like, are we going to pay that price there? And you have to always be ready for the case that if we don't think we're going to extend a guy at that price, we have to be willing to listen, because we don't want him to just leave next year and the best we can get is a third-round comp pick. And DK Metcalf is a much better player than that. He's 27 years old. He's been healthy for the most part. It's much different than Deebo Samuel, who his playing style. I talked to several people at the combine when these trade murmurs were going on before the deal went down. The reason that the 49ers got a fifth-round pick for him is because teams are scared about the durability factor and his playing style. DK Metcalf, there are not those reservations with him. So Green Bay is the team, as I reported, Dan. They had the two ingredients that John Schneider was willing to listen beyond, hey, is DK Metcalf available? It's the fact they have the 23rd pick, and Green Bay was considering that as an option. And they've got two receivers that the Seahawks liked in the pre-draft process in Dontavion Wicks and Romeo Dubs. So they had the package. New England couldn't do that. I mean, if New England would have offered their top 5 pick, then John Schneider would perk up. But that's not going to happen. He's not going to take a second-round pick, and New England doesn't have any receivers they're interested in. Buffalo and Kansas City have just been kind of monitoring this situation. So it's not like a million teams have called John Schneider about this, but Green Bay has been the one that not only has been serious about this, they have put together a couple of different packages that at least got John Schneider listening. And so that's the report. I'm sticking with it. Yeah. If that's what happened, fans can say what they're going to say, but it doesn't mean Metcalf's getting traded. They're not actively looking to deal him, but there's always a price that teams are willing to move on from guys, especially when they got 1 year left in their deal.
Yeah, you weren't saying it was going to happen. You were just saying that discussions had gotten so far down the road that specifics were discussed and
it was worth looking at. Absolutely.
Yeah. If every conversation that's had in Indianapolis during the week of the combine became public, I think it would make fans' heads spin as to how much of that stuff is happening in restaurants and bars and things like that late at night after the workouts are over. Where does it stand now if you had to rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, the likelihood that he gets moved sometime between now and the beginning of the season?
Yeah, with Devontae Adams getting cut, I think that is one domino that plays in favor of him not going anywhere, because I can now see Green Bay, because they don't have to trade for him, going out and bringing back Devontae Adams if he's interested in going back to Green Bay. We'll see if that fit is there. I would say 2 out of 10 is what I would say at this point. I said 25% this weekend, right now around 20%. I still think that Green Bay could potentially try to make something happen, especially if Devontae Adams wants to go with Aaron Rodgers to, say, the Giants or somewhere else and doesn't want to go back to Green Bay. They could very easily circle back and try to make this work again and maybe up the ante price-wise. So I'm not going to sit here and say that it's impossible, but I would still be leaning, just as I was with my reports last week, that, look, Seattle is going to try to extend him. I still think that's the number one thing they'd like to do. But if the right offer's there, then don't be surprised if it happens. That's the NFL.
Kind of reminds me of the year before Russ was traded. The report came out about the Bears offer and it had specifics involved, and there were people that denied that as well. So, look what happened a year later. As far as his extension talks are going, this feels to me like one of those things that doesn't have to happen right away. Yep. In fact, maybe the timing would make more sense closer to training camp as sort of that last piece to clear space for the draft picks and practice squad and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't seem like there's a sense of urgency. Is that what you feel like, or is this the kind of thing that if it drags on a little bit, do you see DK being the type that might do a hold in, refuse to practice, that kind of thing until a new deal gets done?
Well, he got his last extension 3 days into training camp. I think that it's most likely that it's going to be closer to that pathway than him getting an extension right now. And I'll give you one big reason why. The Seahawks at most can save $10 million against the cap by extending DK Metcalf. There's a much larger dead cap hit with him. Geno Smith, on the other hand, you can open up to $23 million. You could sign like 4 free agents with the money that you can open up with Geno Smith, extending him for the next couple of years. And if you add a void year in the back, which Snyder's now been much more willing to do, then you can have even more flexibility. But they can open up to $23 million. You can go from 44 down to 23 plus 20, or actually it'd be 21. I'm not good at math. I was a social studies teacher. 21 million cap hit. Think about the amount of money, the flexibility that you could have now to be able to go out and get players, and you have your quarterback secured for the next few years.
Let's talk about that, because the big news today was the Seahawks have released 4 players: Rayshon Jenkins, Roy Robertson-Harris, George Fant, and Draymond Jones. All of those, I did a show this morning in advance of that report that, those all, for me, fit into that bucket of no-brainers. Like, those are the easy moves that you make where you get a legitimate cap savings without too much damage to the roster. Although I think the door would be open for a couple of those guys to maybe come back if the market isn't what they want when they get into free agency. So they have a little over $16 million in cap space as we sit here today. That's enough to go shopping in free agency to get started with, right? But there's a couple of moves that maybe we were expecting to see at the same time that there was no news of today. The biggest one is Tyler Lockett. Would save $17 million against the cap if he's released. We all expect it to happen. The tone that John Schneider used when he spoke about the discussions in Indianapolis made it sound inevitable. What do you think the holdup is? What's the timeline on making a decision and a move with Tyler?
I think that a release of Tyler Lockett is announced either tomorrow or Thursday. I think it's coming the next day or two. I do think that the Seahawks are going to kind of give him his own day. They didn't want to lump him in with the 4 players. And there's no offense to Draymond Jones and those guys, but none of those players have been with the Seahawks for 10 years like Tyler Lockett has. None of them are iconic Ring of Honor caliber players. Like, when they make that move, it's going to be similar to when Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner had their day, where no other moves were announced. We're going to celebrate these 2 iconic stars. I think you're going to see the same setup with Tyler Lockett. And if I had to predict, I think it's going to be announced tomorrow. That's my opinion. But I think in the next 48 hours, because they want to give him time to be able to find his next landing spot too. And that's how the Seahawks have done business. But I do think they would have viewed it as unfair to the player for what he's accomplished, what he's done off the field, to lump him in with a bunch of guys. He's going to get his own day where the organization can truly celebrate his greatness and what he's done for the Seattle Seahawks.
And then that right there gets him to about $33 million in cap space. And now you really can go shopping. You can get the Ernest Jones deal done. We'll talk about that in a second. And then get out into the market. But the other one is Uchenna Nwosu. And we know that they've been talking about extending him. They want to keep him on the roster. That's why they moved back his roster date, which was supposed to happen on Valentine's Day, I believe. Where does that stand from what you understand?
Well, it's funny because if you were monitoring on social media today, and I'm not the one that noticed this, it was actually one of my readers that asked me a question like, have they done something with Uchenna Nwosu's contract? Because if you did look, the cap savings went from 8.2 to 2.2 million. It was a 6 million difference. And so I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a salary cap expert. I've gotten a lot better with it working this job, but I was trying to dig through it. I'm like, but the cap hit didn't change for next year or this year. Like, what is going on here? And ultimately, as a few fans ended up pointing out, and then I did some digging, realized that there was no move made. Over the cap just omitted the fact that they skipped the bonus day or delayed the bonus day. So they put that 6 million as guaranteed. And so that ended up taking it off that cap savings, even though it has been pushed back by the Seahawks. I'm expecting that this deal is going to get done at some point this week as well. They've been talking to Nwosu and his reps for several weeks. This has been something they've been working on. And my prediction, this is based on what I heard when I was in Indianapolis behind the scenes. I think they're going to try to do something like they did with Draymond Jones last year, where it's not a traditional restructure. They're not just kicking money to next year. They're going to add a void year so they can spread out that cap hit and not all that burden's falling on 2026. That's what I'm expecting is going to happen. It's not an extension, but it's going to allow them to have more cap flexibility. And John Schneider's been more willing to do the void years with the cap going up so much every year. He can absorb these moves. So he's kind of changed his tune on using those.
Yeah, in fact, I think Seahawks are number 1 in a certain category, which is available cap space for 2026. So, we have that to celebrate. And certainly some of that money will be eaten up in some of the extensions that are coming down the pike. The other one that didn't happen today that I found really interesting was Noah Fant. It's a big cap hit, $13.4 million for a guy that we've all kind of been waiting for that breakout season, but someone that Mike McDonald called a complete tight end last week. We know Clint Kubiak loves to use his tight ends, a lot of 12 and 13 personnel. It would stand to reason that number is a little too rich and that they would be looking, I think he's still just 27, maybe 28 years old, right? That they might be looking to extend him. Is that kind of what we can expect?
This is the one player that I have had the hardest time trying to target what is going to happen this offseason. Draymond Jones, it was pretty obvious that Seattle was not going to keep him that cap hit. We know that Tyler Lockett, barring a miracle, and look, nothing has been suggested to me that miracle has happened, that there's going to be a pay cut and he's going to be back. There were the obvious moves. This was one that going into the offseason that I thought $13 million, I can't see any way that that's a tenable figure. But as you mentioned, Mike McDonald, he was pushing back at the idea that Noah Fant took a step back as a blocker. He pushed back hard against that. And he's been pretty straightforward with his assessment of players, even compared to what Pete Carroll was. As I've always said, Pete Carroll could put shine on a turd. Mike McDonald is not that kind of a guy. He's very straightforward. So I'm wondering if Clint Kubiak came in and said, like, look, Ryan Grubb wasn't able to get out of him, but Juwan Johnson had a big season for me. I think Noah Fant is a much better player and a much more talented player. And I'm going to be running a lot more 2 tight end, 2 receiver sets. So the tight ends are going to have to be a bigger part of the passing game. So I'm wondering if that ends up playing into he can be worth that $13 million, or they do try to do an extension. It's crazy because he could still be a cap casualty, but at this point, I would not be predicting it. I think there's a better chance that he's on the roster at his current cap number, and that might just be the value that Clint Kubiak has with him in his offense.
And then when it comes to Ernest Jones, who, made such a transformative impact on that defense last year when he came over shortly before the trade deadline, and has made it very clear this is where he wants to be, and he wants to stay in Seattle, and he expects it to get done. And he's certainly acting like a guy who's going to be here. He's going to public events and basketball games and things, and tweeting out, hey, 12s, come say hi. And even the Seahawks' own PR team or social media team tweeted out some highlights of him, less than 24 hours ago. Do you expect that to be similar to last year with Leonard Williams, where maybe it gets past the official start of free agency before a deal is done, or do you expect it to happen before then?
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and this is just based on the things that I have been told. The fact that John Schneider, it was funny on our off podium, I was the one that asked about Ernest Jones' status, and he was joking with me at the end, like, did you see my phone? And at first I was like, I'm not looking at your phone. What are you talking about?
Something pop up?
And he, an hour earlier, he's like, oh, the reps an hour ago had reached out to me. So there have definitely been discussions. There have been plenty of negotiations going on. I do not see this one leaking into the start of free agency. And look, it might sound silly, but the fact that the Seahawks are parading him around the way that they've been doing, like meeting with UFC fighters in the locker room and stuff, like, would a team be doing that if they didn't think the guy was going to be around? Like, John Schneider's not letting this guy get away. I think he signs a new deal before free agency starts. I wouldn't be shocked if it's at some point next week and they get that done, get that elephant taken out of the room, and then they can really focus on their other free agent priorities.
And then we're calling this state of the roster as we look at that defensive front. Like, now we've had some attrition and some subtractions from a group that, last year looked really, really strong and really, really deep. But the closer you look at it, to me, it becomes a little concerning in that, some of the young guys haven't developed. We haven't seen anything from Cameron Young yet. He hasn't been able to stay healthy. Mike Morris didn't take a step forward last year, as I think a lot of us would have hoped, even though he was healthy for the entire season. And now you take Robertson Harris off the roster. Jaron Reed is an unrestricted free agent as of Wednesday. All of a sudden it gets a little thin. It's Leonard Williams and Byron Murphy. And then what?
Hankins is also a free agent.
And Hankins, another 1-year deal. So he's probably not going to be back. He kind of looked like the proverbial, older designated hitter who lost some bat speed last year. Do you expect Jaron Reed to be back? And then also, do you expect them to be active in free agency at all at that position? Or are they going to tap into this defensive tackle class, which, Daniel Jeremiah says he has 24 starter grades at DT in this draft, and that's about double what they usually have. There's a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, I'll be surprised if they're going to be aggressive going out and getting defensive tackles in free agency. I do think Jaron Reed will be back. To me, if you look at this unrestricted free agent list for the Seahawks, there are 2 players that are must signs, Ernest Jones and Jaron Reed. And then I don't even think there's a mid-level. After that, this is the first time in the 10 years I've been covering this team doing this unrestricted free agent preview. There's usually at least 5 or 6 guys you'd like to find a way to get them back. This year it feels like 2, maybe 3. And then the rest of them, it's like, well, if we can re-sign them in April, maybe for depth. There's not impact players that are in the prime of their careers that you're going to be rushing to sign. Jaron Reed is still a very good player, though. He's an outstanding leader. He's turned into a mentor like Red Bryant and those guys were for him. Not Red Bryant, Atuba Rubin, some of those players that were there when he first came into the league. He's now taken that mantle, and he's been big for guys like Byron Murphy II, some of those young guys on the roster. And I think they're going to get it done. I don't think he's going to be too expensive, and I think he wants to finish his career in Seattle. So I think that gets done. And then the draft, don't be shocked if they pick a DT again in the first round. I'm just going to say that right now. That being said, there's great depth. Rob Rang and I just did our latest mock drafts on Locked On Seahawks, and I picked CJ West in the 4th round out of Indiana. And if you watch Indiana play this year, that dude is a baller at the nose tackle position. And he might fall into day 3 just because there's so much depth up there. So I think they are going to get at least one DT in this class. And Jonathan Hankins probably not coming back. Jaron Reed will be back. But they're going to have to replenish the depth there. And this is the class to do it. I do think that's going to be a position they hit hard again in the draft. Yeah, and that's the good news. The last couple of years, the draft has really been light, figuratively and literally, on those. It's lacked those 320 to 330 pound guys. There's a ton of them in this class, all the way through the whole thing. And that's why I wanted to have this discussion today, because you touched on it. Like, when you look at this roster, and this is one of the things that has afforded them the luxury of being able to kick some of the salary can down the road with some of these extensions and releases, because the rest of the roster, and I think it's a product of the last 3 drafts in large part, is pretty solid and young and controlled and affordable in a lot of ways. 55 players currently under contract, 15 players on offense that started games in 2024 under contract for 2025, 12 on defense. As you said, there don't seem to be those gaping, gotta have it holes this year on the roster, which would allow them to focus on the one thing that has been the Achilles heel of this team over the last 3 or 4 years, has kept them from making the playoffs or advancing deep into them, and that's the offensive line. I feel like I've been saying this on the record on my show for a couple of weeks, that John Schneider's using different language and a different tone this year when he talks about the offseason. And I think he's essentially telling us it's going to be different. Do you expect them to some level to be aggressive in free agency, trying to help? I was going to use the word fix, but I think there's some solutions already on the roster too, but supplement and kind of upgrade that offensive line, add a really good veteran. Yeah, I think we're going to see a difference in philosophy here. And look, I'm going to go back to the Metcalf report, and it made sense to me once I had the intel that this was going on, because I think when you read through the tea leaves and you look into some of the stuff John Schneider has said, he has made several statements that suggest to me that I need to figure out and reallocate funds for who I'm paying. And I think he's finally getting the hint, like, I've gone so cheap on the offensive line and we've let guys get away. It is time to spend some money there, and not 1 year, $8 million for Luke Jokel. Like, I'm talking spending legit money on a guy that can come in, that's in the prime of his career, can come in and instantly, you mentioned the word fix your offensive line. And I'm going to throw the name out there. And listen, I think there is obviously going to be a borderline where John Schneider says, look, this is not, I can't spend this money. But I think that he is going to go all in for Drew Dahlman. I think that he is going to make a run for the Falcons center. And there's a couple reasons why. First, this was a kid that they loved coming out of Stanford. They had a very high draft grade on him. Second, this is the best zone blocking center in the entire NFL. You turn on the tape, he is fantastic. Very high IQ player. He checks off every box that Clint Kubiak's looking for. And he's talked about how important that center position is. I think that's part of the process here. I think Kubiak and Mike McDonald are going to be saying, we got to get that run game going. How do you get it going? That anchor position in the middle. So I'm not going to sit here and say they get it done. There's going to be other teams that want him because it's not a deep center free agency class. Yeah. But I can see John Schneider finally sinking his teeth into, and I mentioned this in Locked On Seahawks today, Dan. I'm hoping that the lesson he learns from the Draymond Jones thing is not, we can't invest big money in a player. I hope that is not the lesson that he takes from that. Yeah. I'm hoping that he learns, hey, instead of picking a guy that was good but not great and we're projecting here, let's go get a young guy, spend a little bit more money, get a young guy that we already know is really good and has done it for multiple seasons at a position that we have not been able to draft and develop. So again, to me, Drew Dahlman is a home run. If they signed him for $15-16 million per year, I wouldn't bat an eye. To me, they have got to reinvest their money and reallocate their money to that offensive line. And they have not had a good center since Max Unger left. It's been a decade. They got to do something about that. And I think John Schneider finally understands that. And it makes sense to go for a veteran there because of Kubiak's comments about how, his scheme kind of revolves around an elite center. Yep. How much responsibility he puts on the center's plate as far as calling the protections, takes it off of the quarterback's list of responsibilities. And just the fact that they have a bunch of young guards on the roster that have some upside still, and it's such a strong guard class.
makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned it. He's going to have a market. I think every single fan of every football team out there thinks their team's going to get Drew Dalman. He seems to be sort of the hot buzzy name, but he's not a perfect, he's not a fit for every scheme. He's strictly a zone guy because of his size. And that was a knock on him coming out of Stanford. It's why he lasted till the 4th round. There's been some speculation he may push that Creed Humphrey number. You mentioned 15, 16 million a year. Is that where you kind of think his market taps out?
Yeah, maybe it goes above that just because we know how linemen get paid in free agency, and John Schneider
overpaid
or not, like they are going to get paid. It's a supply and demand thing. So we'll see what ends up happening. The fact is, though, there are a couple other free agent centers, and they're not maybe the long-term options, but Ryan Kelly is an underrated zone blocker, and he can obviously move people too. He's an older player, but he's still just 2 years removed from his last really good season. He had some injuries last year. That might still be a guy that's worth kicking the tires on. And if you want to look away from the center spot, I mean, I think there's a few decent centers in this draft class too that would fit this scheme. If you want to go with the guard spot, Trey Smith not being available is a big hit, but there's still a lot of depth there. Maybe you take Aaron Banks from the 49ers or Tevin Jenkins, who finally was healthy the last couple of years. I still think has a high ceiling from the Bears and is a really athletic former tackle. There are options out there that maybe you wouldn't have to necessarily break the bank for. But again, I feel like John Schneider has kind of been hinting like, look, maybe we're still going to overpay. I feel like there is a position, it's probably going to be center, that he's going to be trying to make a splash here because he understands. I think there's a seat that's getting warm underneath it. And I think he's got to understand at this point that this 9-8 stuff or 10-7 and missing the playoffs, like this ain't cutting it. Like we're expected to be in the playoffs and competing for championships. The offensive line is the thing that is holding them back from doing that. So if he finally addresses that with a real investment in free agency that instantly makes this line better, that's the best way to get over that rut and get this team back to competing for titles.
Yeah, he actually said on his radio show 2 weeks ago, I'm probably going to have to overpay this year. And some took it as a off the cuff joke, but I kind of thought that's Schneider's way of sort of like, giving you a little nugget.
He's telling the agents out there, hey, we're open for business.
Yeah. And I've been saying nothing would change the narrative, some of the negative narrative that fans have about John Schneider, more completely and quickly than that one signing. If you were to be able to lock up Drew Dalman, I think that would go a long way towards people going, okay, all right, we'll give him some grace here. And then we go into the draft from there. Coming out of the combine, watching all the workouts, who are your draft crushes right now? Guys that you just think are such a good fit for the Seahawks team on either side of the ball that it makes almost too much sense.
I got to start at the guard position. My favorite player in this draft class, Tate Ratledge. And look, the dude, he's got a mullet, but I'm calling it the Ratledge. It's now renamed. The dude's mullet waving in the air. He's got that perfect mustache. But the dude was a 9.98 athlete on the relative athletic scored scale. What he did in Indy, like this dude is known for mauling people. Like he wasn't necessarily viewed as a athletic zone blocker. And going back and watching his tape from 2 years ago, I started changing my tune on that. But then seeing what he did in Indy and just how fluid of an athlete this dude is, and he obviously a Georgia offensive lineman, those guys are all head knockers. Like they like to mash dudes off the line of scrimmage. Ratledge is a player that I already liked, but now I would say that he is my draft crush in this group. I love the way that he plays the game. As far as offensive linemen, him and Donovan Jackson are my two favorite guards. I really like both those players, and I think they offer a lot of flexibility. Gray Zabel would be the third tier there for me. This is a good guard class. There's a lot of really good guards, but if you can get Ratledge or Jackson at pick 50, even if Seattle traded back and took Ratledge into the first round, I wouldn't bat an eye. That's the kind of player I think that he is. I think he's a really good football player. He had an ankle injury last year, but I really like Ratledge. At the receiver position, Jalen Noel. I already loved him going into the combine, and he goes out and just absolutely lights it up. He can return kicks and punts. He kind of reminds me of Tyler Lockett coming out of Kansas State. I see a lot of similar skills. He's a very smooth route runner, a good locker room guy, a leader. He's a player in the middle rounds that I think could make a ton of sense for the Seahawks at the receiver position. And listen, I got to talk running backs for a second. This is the best running back class that I have ever seen. And the guy that is not getting talked about enough. I mean, I would talk about Ashton Jeanty this entire episode, but Seattle's not getting Ashton Jeanty. DJ Giddens from Kansas State, to me, is the best pure zone running back in this entire class. And when you look at him physically, you wouldn't think that. He's tall and he's a bigger back. He's 6'2", 215. You would think this guy would be a bulldozer, but that's not his game. He kind of reminds me of Sean Alexander coming out of Alabama. He's a glider, and he makes dudes miss more than you would think. And he's got incredible vision. He knows when that crease is going to open before it opens, which is crucial with zone running. I think he would be an absolute stud in Clint Kubiak's system. So DJ Giddens, another guy that I absolutely love, that just did even more than I thought he was going to do in the combine. On the defensive side of the football, Darius Alexander, the DT from Toledo. This is a deep defensive tackle class. You turn on the tape, you watch this. You were at the Senior Bowl. You get to see what he was doing in Mobile.
Yep.
This dude is a freak athlete, and he showed it at the combine. Really good first step. He's disruptive. He is a 3-down defender. I like him a lot. And in the secondary, I always mess up his name. The safety from South Carolina, Emmanuel.
Yeah,
that kid. Listen,
trying to add an extra syllable there. Yeah, it's Emmanuel.
Yeah, I always mess it up, even though I've watched this kid play for the last 3 years. I saw him as a true freshman and thought that kid is going to be a stud in the NFL. And then he watched this last year, 6'3", 220, and he had 2 pick sixes. Like, this guy is an incredible cover safety. He comes up and smacks people. He's a sound tackler against the run. He can play single high safety at that size. I've heard some people compare him to Cam Chancellor. He's got a lot different skill set than Cam Chancellor did. But he's kind of a blend of Chancellor and Kyle Hamilton. And that should right there get you excited. I mean, the dude is not a combine warrior. This guy is an all-American, fantastic football player. And you can't tell me Mike McDonald. If he's there at 18, I picked him at 18 in my latest mock draft. If he somehow slips to 18, John Schneider might pull a hammy doing it, but he's going to be sprinting up to the phone to make that call because they love playing 3 safety sets. This guy has a chance to be a perennial all-pro. He's that kind of a talent.
And then we've already touched on the free agent market at the top of the range, right? The guy that everybody would like to have and some of those other guard names that you mentioned. But John Schneider loves bargain shopping and free agency as well. It's got him in trouble sometimes. He likes to do those mid-level deals to bring in veterans to hedge against what he views as weaknesses on the roster so he can let the draft come to him. Last year in particular, struck out on just about every single one of those signings. But those are always, every team's looking to bring those types of contracts on board and get guys in and plug them in on one-year deals. Are there guys in this class that you think would be really, really smart fits that maybe the casual fan wouldn't be thinking of or might not even be aware of?
This is going to maybe upset some of your fans, but I'm literally going to mention all offensive players here. I do not think from a personnel standpoint, maybe they bring back a Roy Robertson Harris or somebody like that at a much cheaper price, but I do not see them overspending for DTs or edge rushers. Maybe somebody like a Mike Hilton, if they want to play Devin Witherspoon outside more, could make some sense at the corner spot, depending on his price. If Ernest Jones leaves, and again, I don't think that's going to happen, maybe there's a few linebackers. Cody Barton coming back. Cody Barton was great in Denver last year. He was a borderline Pro Bowl All-Pro caliber player in Denver's defense. So there's some options on that front, but I don't see any value signings that make a ton of sense, in my opinion. On offense, I see several. I want to start on the offensive line, and I threw a few of these names out. Patrick McCarry from Baltimore, who Mike McDonald's going to know because he was on the team. He's played both tackle spots. He can play guard. He's played center before. Very versatile player that can zone and gap block, and he's still in his late 20s. So I think he's got a lot of good football left in him, and this is still a deep guard class. You might be able to get him at a reasonable price. And Aaron Banks from the 49ers, take away from your division rival. He's obviously already played in a Shanahan style scheme. He is athletic for his size. He's still a young player at 27 years of age. And I think you can get him for a decent price point. So those 2 guards. At the receiver position, I'm going to stick with another NFC West rival. Tutu Atwell has been a guy that has not put up big numbers since coming out of Louisville. But it always seems like against the Seahawks, he finds a way. And I think this past year in a reduced role, you saw a lot more consistency from him. He's still a young player, and he can return kicks. That is a guy buy low that has high dividend that could potentially fill a lot of the stuff that Tyler Lockett did for most of his career. He has a similar skill set. So I think Tutu Atwell makes sense. And then at the tight end spot, let's say that Noah Fant isn't coming back, and there's still a chance maybe that ends up happening. Why not go get the guy that Clint Kubiak featured in his offense last year?
Yeah.
Juwan Johnson is a really good receiving tight end. You put him with A.J. Barner, draft somebody like Jackson Hawes in day 3 that's just going to maul people. You have Baskin-Robbins group of tight ends. Just pick your flavor and mix and match them. I think that the Seahawks could have a really fun offense with Juwan Johnson at a lesser price than they've got with Noah Fant. I don't think he's quite as physically gifted, but he's a former receiver. He can move, and he can catch the football, and he's only a few years removed from a 5-touchdown season. That would be a guy that makes a lot of sense to me, too, for the Seahawks. And let's add a fullback here real quick. Because why not go out and – you've got some links here. You either get Adam Prentice, who was a fullback in New Orleans for Kubiak last year, or really make a bold move. Go get Patrick Ricard from the Baltimore Ravens, who Mike McDonald knows, and put him in front of Ken Walker III and Zach Charbonnet and Kenny McIntosh. Patrick Ricard is an absolute monster. And I'm going to throw an X factor out here. If Kyle Juszczyk doesn't take a pay cut, the 49ers might cut him. If that happens, I think John Schneider will be on an airplane before the sentence breaks that he is going to be a free agent and he's going to be trying to get Kyle Juszczyk for his offense. So that is a wild card to keep an eye on.
I'm really glad you brought Makari's name up. If you hadn't, I was going to ask you about him specifically, because one thing that does not exist on this roster right now is a swing tackle. You know, Stone Forsythe no longer under contract, probably not going to be back. George Fant was supposed to fill that role, couldn't stay healthy. I don't see Michael Jarrell as a guy that can play left tackle. Really, I don't know if his skill set fits there. So it'd be a real advantage to have a guy like that that can play basically all 5 positions. I like that. You got time for a couple of questions?
Oh, yeah.
Let's see what we got here. This is where I always have to put the glasses on. Makes me look smart.
You can still love Seahawks stuff, but age catches all of us.
Oh boy, does it! David Pankey agrees with your your Tate Ratledge pick there.
I wish I could grow a Ratledge, but that was about 20 years ago for me.
I agree. Emin Worry's a stud, and this is a guy whose game would fit in with Kobe Bryant and Julian Love on the field at the same time, right? Like his most common comp I see, you know, physically and in what his role will be able to be is Kyle Hamilton and the way that McDonald used him in Baltimore, right?
It's a defensive weapon, and Kobe Bryant can still be a nickel safety. The amount of flexibility that you would have as a former coach, just the idea of all the different things you could do with those 3 players, it would be incredibly exciting. And look, when Jamal Adams had all the injuries, Quandre Diggs, and what they were trying to do with Julian Love that first year, like there was potential there. But I would say that this group with youth and just the playmakers, the athleticism, sign me up all day. Again, if he's there at 18, I think Josh Schneider's sprinting to the phone to get him.
Thanks for the donation, Dogzilla Monster. He's got a question for you. Has Corbin heard about all the calls about Lakin? Now, you've done a series on the Emerald City Spectrum website. Fantastic new Pacific Northwest journalistic website, by the way, which I'll let you plug at the end. And you go through every single impending unrestricted free agent that the Seahawks have and explore whether or not they might bring him back or why they might let him walk. Is there a scenario where Lakin Tomlinson might be back on a cheap deal again?
I'm going to put that at 10%, and that might seem a little bit high for some fans, but there's one reason why I have it that high. John Benton coached Lakin Tomlinson with the Jets, and that was the last good season that Lakin Tomlinson had, was when he was with John Benton. And Benton might look at this as a situation where even if he's not going to be a starter, I want to have that veteran presence that has been in my system, understands how I coach players. So I would say that's where the 10% comes in, but I don't think it happens till April. Like, I don't think this is let's quickly rush and go sign him. Like, they're going to wait. And if he's available and they've had a chance to look through what they've signed and, hey, we've still got a spot, let's go back and bring him in veteran minimum, then it could happen. But as for, hearing whether there's been calls, like the dude's not under contract, guys. So John Schneider's not going to be fielding calls for Lakin Tomlinson anyway.
George Fant also played for Benton in New York, actually played pretty well there for him when he was healthy. Any chance that maybe if they don't get a guy like Makari, that the door's open for him to return?
It all depends on his knee, because to me, that's what really it puts his career on tenuous ground right now, because he's now into his 30s and he had 30 snaps last year and he just could not get healthy. maybe this offseason he got the work done he needed to avert that moving forward. But bulky knees and veteran tackles don't go well together. So if I had to hedge bets, I'm saying he's not coming back.
Yeah, that's my big hesitation. The fact that the knee was so bad he couldn't play, but the fact that it didn't also require surgery, at least to our knowledge, that indicates that maybe there's something a little more long-term there going on. Let's talk about Geno Smith and his contract situation. So he's got the roster bonus due on the 6th. It's the 16th, I believe, right?
Yep.
4 days after the start of the league year. Is it imperative that they get a deal done before that bonus is paid out?
I think it is. Now, I don't think they're going to be announcing this on March 6th like they did 2 years ago. I think it's going to take a little bit more time than that. But it goes back to what I said about the cap space they can open up. And if you let that bonus date pass, then that really limits the amount of cap space that you can create, because now those non-prorated bonuses have been paid out. But if you extend them before then, you can transition those into prorated bonuses that are spread out over the life of the new contract. So that's part of the way that you can open up cash flow and cap space this year. I think you got to get it done before the start of free agency, at the latest right at the start of free agency, so that you have that cap space and you don't have to pay those non-prorated bonuses. You can spread them out on a new contract.
Here's one I hadn't thought of. People are always looking for connections. I know we did last year when McDonald was hired, and it was kind of surprising that no one came from Baltimore to Seattle last year, especially on the defensive side of the ball. There's been a lot of speculation, as you mentioned, Adam Prentice, but potentially Lucas Patrick, a guy that can play both guard spots, Juwan Johnson, and then, a lot of people have speculated maybe Taysom Hill if they did a post June 1, because they're in such cap hell there. I didn't think about Shaheed. Apparently, if this is correct, it would save about $4 million. Now, I know he's coming off the knee injury. Not sure what his timeline to return is, but he really seemed like a fun toy that Kubiak was getting the most out of before the knee injury.
I'd be surprised if New Orleans moves on from him, just because he's still a pretty young player and he's electric and he's got special teams ability. They are going to have to make some difficult moves with players like Taysom Hill to open up cap space, but I don't see Shaheed being a cap casualty. I think that's a guy that they're going to figure out how to keep him around.
I thought this when you were talking about Atwell. I didn't want to say it, but someone else did, so we'll throw it in there. This is in one of the things that raised my eyebrows when you brought up his name. Is it seems like that's the type of player they've been looking for quite a while. It's what they thought they were going to get in D. Eskridge. And in fact, he was drafted right ahead of Atwell, and there were reports the Rams preferred Eskridge, and they turned to Atwell afterwards. And my buddy who does content creation for the Rams, Jake Ellenbogen, said consistently over Atwell's 4-year career that he thought he was an underutilized guy that had more upside. He always seemed to have his best games against the Seahawks. But that is the type.
I think he was a guy that had a
log
logjam in front of him, and there just weren't a lot of opportunities. But when they threw the ball to him deep, like, Seattle couldn't cover it, and he's still a legitimate 4.3 speed guy.
All right. I mean, I don't have a whole lot more time, but most of the questions were kind of touched on already. So good job on your part. As always, thanks for coming on the show. I know you're a busy guy. Locked On Seahawks. You want to catch that, but tell people about the new venture as well. I want to give you the stage for a moment. Let you talk about Emerald City Spectrum. Yeah,
if you haven't already heard, I've had some people tell me to stop spamming, but it's my website. I own it. If I want to advertise it, I can. EmeraldCitySpectrum.com. It is a subscription website. Look, 1 cup of coffee a month, $6 a month. We've got on-site Seahawk reporters, Husky reporters, Storm reporters. We're going to have a Sounders reporter on site. Like, we are building something that I'm very excited about. And we've already got 6 teams that we have reporters that are covering, writing long form, real journalism, no clickbait, the way that people really want it. Again, it's an affordable price point. It's $6 a month, or you can get a year subscription to the Emerald Spectrum for $60, a little bit less per month. So we've got a couple options for you there, but no ads, smooth running website, just all Seattle sports all the time. So again, EmeraldCitySpectrum.com. Make sure to check it out. If you're just a fan of sports in the Pacific Northwest, we're going to have the Cougars coming soon as well. So we're going to have all the teams, pro and college, in Seattle covered for you.
And that's what I was going to mention too. I love the interface, and the fact it's subscription based means there's no ads. There's some big time sports websites that it's hard to go to anymore just because you're just inundated and it locks everything up. And so there's certain sites I can't open when I'm on live because it'll start auto playing and giving you a bunch of audio and everything else. So I really appreciate that. And kudos to you for throwing it together pretty quickly and making it look so damn good. So
Dan, I'll be honest. When I started this venture, I thought this was going to be a 3 or 4 months trying to just get things jump started. And we have vastly exceeded those expectations. I've had a few people like, how are you getting all these writers? Because we're doing good work and people want to be part of it. And I'm grateful for that. So I'm grateful for the support from all the readers that have already jumped on board. And we're just getting started. So that's what I'm really excited about.
Time for some outro music. I know you're a fan of this genre. Always good to have you on the show. Everybody, again, check out the website and the podcast. As far as this channel, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell for notification of future episodes. All the other ways you can support the channel are listed down below. Corbin, thanks. We'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm going to headbang my way out of here.
Forever and always, go Hawks. Thanks for watching, guys.